you so much for coming to the final conference of a series that's been funded by the ESRC under the title Racism and Political Mobilisation. It's organised by myself, Gargi Bhattacharya, and by my colleague Aaron Winter, who is here, and Satnam Verdi, who is here. We've run a series of 6 events around the country to try to bring together different themes and thinking about how people have mobilised through racism, but also mobilised against racism, and different kinds of historical moments and different locations of doing that. We wanted to have a larger conference at the end, really to bring together much of the more recent research and to have a bigger dialogue between people in different subfields about this, and we're so happy you could join us. I should tell you immediately that Faiza Shaheen cannot be here today. Her mother passed away very recently and she was trying to come, but she is not able to come today. But we're still very happy and lucky to have an opening session with Professor John Solomos. We're going to try and do that as a conversation. I know the word conversation is much misused in our discipline, but me and John really do that, so I think it could be a proper dialogue. But because my voice is not so great, the questions that I have, I'm going to have up on PowerPoint. So if you don't quite catch what I say, you'll hear what I say on there. And John, I think, has more voice and has a mic as well. We're hoping to have a first part, which is our slightly prepared conversation, and then a more open debate, which could be about things that John has said, but also about looking forward to the conference as a whole, and as we know, the very urgent challenges that we're all facing. As you can see, even I have learned that you need to tweet things, and Aaron has very kindly come up with ESRC racisms as our hashtag. Please don't say ESRC racism, because we all have to work in the sector in years to come. But after this, there'll be a short tea break again back in that room. All of the refreshment breaks will be in the room you started in, and then we'll have parallel sessions after that. Right, I'm just going to get onto the other, do this backwards thing that you have to do. As you can gather, the small screen is not working, and so I have to do this. There we go. So would you like to stand? Or shall I turn this round so you can sit as well? Stand. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to sit there. So it's not so doctor interrogation. But it is a bit like a kind of a defence from a different period. So you feel that you can join the profession. Well, thanks so much for coming, John. And I was going to introduce John, but I don't know if he needs an introduction. People will know that Professor John Solomos has been a gargantuan figure in the field of race and ethnic studies for many years. He's been a big brother and mentor to many of us in the field. Now I realise not only within Britain, but increasingly I meet people from other parts of the world, and John has been their external or played a mentoring role to them. He's a long-time editor of ethnic and racial studies and has really used that journal to establish the role of the field of research that we're all engaged in across the world. He's the editor and author and co-author of many influential books, including books such as Race and Racism in Britain that I bet every single person in this room has written an essay about at some point in their lives. So it's that kind of big brotherly role, not in the surveillance role of the big brotherly. Let us bring our family together to do things. But we're so happy that John agreed to open the conference. And the first thing we were hoping to ask, as I've suggested, is that lots of the things you've done have been about creating institutional space for this kind of work, including dedicated programs, helping to foster the networks. You know, I always say that the first time I ever met John, I was an undergraduate who just found the Race and Ethnic Studies group at Birkbeck. And I didn't have enough money for lunch, but I just had enough money for the coach fare, so they had to share their sandwiches with me. That just allowed me to enter the field from that, in that way. And I wondered if you could say a bit about that project of creating institutional space, why it's been important, and where you think that kind of initiative might go now.
Well, Thank you for the introduction. I hope I'm a nice big brother, not a big brother.
No, I don't mean it.
But thank you for the introduction, and I appreciate the sentiment. So I guess there are two or three things I just want to begin in a way which I hope doesn't sound as though I'm just talking about the past. But I guess one of the big influences in my intellectual development has been my involvement, sometime even before. There was even a time before I met Gary, which was in the period around 1981, when a lot of us, the second generation, Gilroy, Valerie Amos, a lot of us were very involved in a group called Race and Politics Group at the Center for Contemporary Culture Studies. And that led to a lot of dialogue and discussion with people like Stu Hall. There's a book of its time called The Empire Strikes Back, which I was part of, and which influenced us in different kind of ways in writing it and producing it. And I think the reason I mentioned that is that for us at the time, in a way the study of race, racism, ethnicity was very much at the beginning of the discussion that we're having today. It wasn't a discussion really that was perhaps fully shaped. So that kind of dialogue, that kind of engagement with others has always been kind of important in my career and my intellectual development. And I've always felt that in a way I enjoy working in an environment where I'm in dialogue with others and I'm in dialogue with people that I kind of enjoy working with and that kind of environment. So that led also to the kind of work I then did at Berkeley initially, when people like Dr. Brian and myself set up one of the master's programs in race and ethnicity after his here today as well. And that kind of engagement with teaching race and ethnic studies was also part of what I began to experience and also believe in gradually as I became a teacher as well as a researcher. At the beginning of my career, I was very much a kind of job researcher for about 6 or 7 years when I was part of a research unit on race relations. And I've always therefore been involved in research. But I've always then engaged a lot in teaching, and the teaching element of university seems to me, and I know as currently head of department, teaching is not a very popular thing among fellow academics, because we all want to be writing and doing research. Teaching to me is part of what we do as universities, and what we do as people working in the field of race, racism, ethnicity, however we draw those boundaries and those kind of themes, is part of what has not only part of what we're employed to do, which is kind of notionally an issue, although many people obviously don't teach this thing. Particularly in a place like Warwick, there's a culture perhaps of people not enjoying teaching so much and not wanting to teach so much, but I've always enjoyed that aspect and want to be part of teaching. And then another element which I think has influenced me a lot is some kind of, sounds a bit hippie, and I went to Sussex, which is very much a hippie university in the old-fashioned sense of the term, so I don't want to sound too hippie though. But I think collegiality is always very important. Supporting others and being supported by others, not just seeing it as a, I don't want to sound as though it's a question of supporting others, because in a way, the reason we support others is often that we need others in the university and in the department. So I think for me, collegiality and working with others has always been quite important. But I also have a kind of, I'm a kind of glass half full kind of person, so I always believe it's possible to change things. So for me, a department or a university is not an institution which is beyond change. I always kind of believe we can change the institution that we work in. So I'm not a very pessimistic kind of guy. I don't really think, for example, that an institution like Warwick is unchangeable and different from me, because I'm part of the institution. And I've always felt that in every institution I work at, I'm part of the institution is part of me, and we can change those institutions. So I think that's kind of where I came from. Sounds a bit hippie, and a bit of where I came from.
Can you just say a bit more, this kind of I didn't know what to call this subdiscipline we're in. And I think race and ethnic studies is not suitable, but the kind of thing that this group of people do in terms of that institutional change, because a lot of what we've done in all the places is made space for that happening in a very collegiate way.
I think one of the things that has become clearer over the last few decades as work in this field has grown in this country, although I think it's also important to acknowledge, and certainly I know from editing the journal for the last 20 years I've edited ethnic and racial studies, which is a bit too long really. I should give up at some point, but I'm too tied in to give up, I guess. I enjoy it too much. But I think one of the things that we've learned, I think, as we have seen this area of research develop, is that it grew up, I guess, initially out of a big concern with issues around immigration, the creation of minority communities in various kind of ways, and then in a way defined the kind of study of race, ethnicity as a kind of study of migration of communities in a way, and certainly that's how initially I think it developed. But I think what is interesting over the last 3-4 decades really is that the field has become much broader, as not just societies like Britain, but many other societies have experienced not just issues of migration, but other kind of issues about minorities, the position of minorities, issues about what is, I guess, one of the big things of today is intersectionality between various kinds of social relationships of race, class, gender, and related kind of intersectionality. So I don't think the field in 80 or 90 is at all anywhere like it is today. So, and I think that's in a way a welcome thing, because I think we shouldn't hold on to the past. We should learn from the past, I tend to think, but at the same time the boundaries of race and ethnicity I think have developed a lot. And I think many people here, and I recognize some faces obviously, that many people here have experienced similar kind of things where we have seen the field develop and change, but also in a way the field changes because it's not like, again, I think in a way academics are part of the kind of, not an ivory tower, but some kind of power in a university, that obviously a field like race and ethnicity doesn't exist outside of the societies or the global environment that we're part of. So the field has changed a lot as we have experienced lots of transformation socially, economically, politically, in societies. And in a way, part of what we do in teaching with the subject, or researching various topics, or editing a journal, or writing books, or writing articles, is to try and engage with the world around us. And the world around us is always evolving and changing. And I think that's part of what I think has happened, that we have a field that is not at all the same, but it should be a good thing that it's changed a lot, and that we are having new perspectives, new agendas. And I noticed recently when I spoke at an event organized by the BSA, postgraduate students and early career researchers, that many of the research topics that we're doing today are very unrecognizable. And I know that from supervising PhDs, but it's not a bad thing that they're unrecognizable. If you were doing research in 80 or 90, it's probably a good thing, because in a way social sciences are about, in a way, meeting the challenges that we have, and that not in a way having a kind of view that is like just in a sense based on the past, but learning also about new agendas. And many of the new agendas we face today in Britain and in other societies are challenging and new. The fact that we live in a political environment that we do today, the fact that we live in a situation where there is various kinds of debates about minorities, majorities, culture, identity. Those kind of debates, I think, we have seen huge advances in how we understand these issues, but we have still a lot to learn, I think. And so I think in a way, some element we've always been willing to learn is important in this field. Because it's not a field which I think it's evolving, and it's moved a long way, and so you have many more academics working in this field in this country, in various kinds of institutions, higher education and other institutions, but the field is still evolving and changing, and which hopefully will, in 10, 20 years, it will be hopefully in a better place. But I don't think what we've done in the past is at all what we should be doing in the future.
Some of your very famous early books and early work and some of the projects that you engaged with seemed very explicitly designed to offer a kind of critique or corrective to broadly institutional racism about the big houses of power in society. And I wondered if you felt that that was still a central objective of the work you do now, and if anything has changed. I think you've already started to look at that might change in the approach you take to those questions of racism and power.
I mean, I think part of the reason was, I guess, some of my, somebody kindly gave me one of my books that I haven't looked at for some time to take to sign. So it's a book that I worked with Brian at the time. And some of my early work, I think, was, I guess, shaped by experience. Because I think one has to remember, and perhaps it's difficult to remember because not all of us were involved in these discussions in the 80s, is that a perspective which put racism at the center of discussion was very much at the margins of sociological and other social science discussions in the 80s. So I guess a lot of us were trying to put a particular perspective about talking about racism as a kind of process, as a kind of institutional process to do with not just the kind of issues that perhaps sociologists like Rex and Benjamin had researched in the 50s, 60s, 70s around immigration, settlement, creation of minorities, but racism as a political phenomenon, racism as a cultural phenomenon, racism in terms of not just employment, housing, but also how it impacts on this kind of more structural processes of politics in society. I guess the reason I came to that kind of research agenda in the kind of work I did on like youth, for example, in the book I did with Les Back on race and politics in Birmingham, is because we felt that the dimension of researching the kind of institutions and the reproduction of racism within institutions wasn't really important in much of the social science literature in the 80s and even going into the 90s. I think it got much more established as an area of research. But at the same time, I guess one of the things that evolved out of my interest in those kind of institutional processes is that I don't think it's a question that we should just focus on institutional racism on its own, because it depends also what we mean by that as well. So one of the things, for example, that I did in the late 90s with Left Back as well, was, and others, was a study of racism in football, which is virtually the only time my children took me seriously, because they thought that was a real thing, researching racism in football was, or at least football in their minds. I think they forgot about the racism thing, which is like, that is doing work on football, and that's interesting. And that research, again, was about institutions. And at the time when we were doing the research, one of the points we were trying to make is that a lot of the focuses on flanks and flank racism, and popular racism in a way on the terraces or the sitting spaces, that is, not the terraces. The terraces don't really exist in the same way. But we emphasize a lot what happens in football associations, what happens in the institutions of football. But at the same time, we wanted to look at what happens at all levels of football in that research. So in a way, my research on institutional kind of aspects also evolved into other areas of influence, through dialogue again. And in doing that research with Les, I learned a lot about things through that collaboration as well, and learning through that process about broadening my horizons for my film vision in a very important to as well. But I still think that today, one of the issues is that if we look at the society around us, there are issues about how key institutions in our society, including universities, including government institutions, including other institutions in society, the private sector, issues about racism and how it works, and how it sort of evolves and changes, are important in our agendas, and should be important perhaps in our agendas, although there's often a kind of argument that goes around that that's racism as an area of research has been marginalized and not so at the center at the moment. I still think it's it's still an area where I think there's a lot of research that should be going on and is going on. I'm not talking with you that they have been fully marginalized in some areas.
Okay. This is kind of leading on even from what you've said, but we know that the last few years in this country has seen a real resurgence of student activism around issues of racism in the university, around curriculum, around staffing, around the treatment of students themselves. We've seen that the National Union of Students become much more vociferous about issues of racism on campus, but also debates such as why is my curriculum white, why is my professor black, all of those kinds of debates have kind of re-energized debates about racism within our own sector. And I wondered if you thought that those kinds of campaigns had had an impact on the broader field, and if so, in what way, or what are the kinds of intersections or
I mean, I guess I relate to that question in a number of ways, but I'll just highlight one or two responses. I guess the first point is that I think within universities, a lot of the focus was initially, I think, not about teaching. It was perhaps more talking about racism more generally rather than about the curriculum teach. So I'm not totally surprised in a way that there is a lot of discussion about the curriculum and what is it that we cover, not just in sociology, but in many social sciences disciplines and other disciplines. So in a way, to me, this kind of situation that we're in is one where I think there are quite legitimate and important discussions about the curriculum. There are quite important discussions and also about, and you know, as a head of department in a university like work, I'm also quite aware that there are a lot of discussions about wages of being employed in most universities that we treasure, value, and like to work in. And I think a lot of the discussion about employment of academics with diverse backgrounds or recruitment of researchers or others, recruitment of students from diverse backgrounds are very live discussions. So I relate to them as questions which I think we should be discussing. There should be a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. I sort of also agree that we should be discussing, you know, what's often called the kind of decolonization of the curriculum or those agendas. But then also, I don't hold back, but I sort of get a bit nervous about what the consequences of that might be, in some of the more radical versions of that argument. So, what kind of sociology we should be teaching should be like a lively, boisterous discussion, not a discussion where we say yes to everything that is demanded. So, for example, introduction to sociology courses, to me, are not a set thing. We shouldn't, you know, rule out what we teach at home. But at the same time, throwing away a lot of the sociological classics and those kind of options, you know, they're not avenues which I feel would be that productive. And I think we should be having that dialogue. And students sometimes, you know, have views which we might share to a point, but there's a point at which perhaps we should also say, whoa, let's sort of let's have that discussion rather than assume we should just throw away all the classics, for example. So I take a view which is partly that I do see where those discussions are happening. I do think that issues about employment, issues about recruitment of students, achievements of their issues about reclassification, all those discussions which we have. And actually I've been having for the last 2 days of work because my department is going to teaching and learning and review. And one of the questions is, what do you do to deal with issues about achievement gap between minority and white students? And all those kind of discussions. Those are discussions which I think we should be having and which we should all be having. That includes students. So they should actually be having a discussion. Not in a way assuming that there's just one answer. Because it seems to me that sometimes we should say to students that, look, we've thought a lot about this, but we don't fully agree with you. It's not a very popular thing to say. In my department meetings often I sound not exactly reactionary, What I sound is what I'm saying, there is something to hold on to the classics in terms of what we teach. And I think that doesn't mean that we shouldn't change the curriculum, but I think having a dialogue rather than always giving in to demands and not talking about what's what the consequences might be of abandoning the whole tranche of quite interesting intellectual and other achievements.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask a follow-on question, I'll wait to see.
You already touched on this in your opening about kind of shifts in the centre of gravity in the field. And I'm guessing it shows more my generation how I frame this question. For some time there seems to have been something of a divide between migration studies and what I'm still calling race and ethnic studies, or studies of racism, what better. And I wondered if you thought there'd been more recently a coming together of those areas, or perhaps not, because you're telling the story somewhat differently, but the emergence of the study of racism and sociology kind of goes alongside a certain migratory history. Whereas I'm thinking of a period in which, within these institutional spaces, there's something called migration studies as burgeoned, really. And then there's people who study racism, which seems as if that's another part of the corridor. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think in practice, and I experienced this also, not just in terms of teaching in this area and working in this area, but also in terms of the kind of editorial role of editing the journal, which is historically, over the last 40 years of its existence, has had this idea that it covers everything to do with migration, race, ethnicity, nationalism. But I think there is a way in which I think, particularly in the 21st century rather than in the 20th century, a lot of the focus of attention is on migration studies. There are people trying to create almost league tables of journals of migration studies, which we haven't really had in ways, or even in bigger areas of sociology. We don't have league tables, but I noticed in migration studies people are trying to grade ethnic migration studies as what kind of college, because we think we're the top journal, but we don't necessarily think that we're the top journal, we're a race journal, whereas we're not a migration journal. So I experienced that, and I think there's been a huge division that has developed, not just culturally in this country, but in many countries, including the US, around migration scholars and race scholars. And I think part of the context of that is that it's just part of the way in which, in a way, academic disciplines evolve and change. That migration studies have become a way in which people grab certain spaces in the universities, grab certain spaces in research institutions, including money and resources to do research. But I don't think necessarily that means that the study of race and ethnicity has been separate from the study of migration, mobility, movement, etc. Because in a way, both in the US and here, and in other countries, I think there have been kind of historical links between the study of migration and the study of race and ethnicity. And I think it's those links that should provide us with a way in which we can, with some confidence, say to migration scholars that they shouldn't be so ignorant of what has happened in the past. Because quite often I think they're reinventing debates rather than actually initiating debates. They're reinventing research that other scholars have done, perhaps with the frame of race and ethnicity studies, but almost sort of dismissing that historical legacy of research culture. And I think part of the dialogue that should be going on is to have that dialogue, and I think that's part of what we're trying to do in resilience and anti-migration studies, although I do notice that, that the migration scholars tend to have quite a different language. But when they don't preoccupy themselves with questions about race and racism, they preoccupy themselves with different debates. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to engage in dialogue. Sometimes it will be difficult dialogue because it's almost having different language of academic discourse and debate. And there are competing money agendas in terms of where research goes. I think that dialogue should be still plenty.
I asked you a bit more about the dialogue, because you said something about the ways in which, broadly scholars of migration might learn something from looking at the longer history of studies of scholars of racism. I wondered if the other way around, if there's anything about people who might focus more on racism might benefit from seeing what's happening in debates about migration.
I think one of the issues which I think has been confused in some of the language which has been reinvented about diversity, super diversity, etc., is that there's a tendency to sort of almost rareify these categories. And so sometimes we're a bit sort of critical of these categories. But I think there is a way in which the research on super diversity highlights issues about the complexities of migration patterns, migration movements in the last 2 decades, 3 decades, which I think should be part of an agenda that looks also at racism, because I don't think we should be assuming that the migration issues have led to the formation in the way of a kind of field of race emphasis in this country from the 40s, 50s, 60s. We shouldn't be assuming that we're not relevant, but we shouldn't be assuming we're the same. That's what has happened in the last 2 or 3 decades, and I think there are ways in which. So the dialogue should be a two-way dialogue about learning about the way in which a city like London, for example, is very different today after the last 2 decades, 3 decades of different kinds of migration than it was 20, 30 years ago, or not just London, but Birmingham. So the research we did in Birmingham with less, I think, in the context of the kind of late 70s, 80s, would be very different than what's done today. And I think those kind of processes are kind of sense. So it's not perhaps just a question of, sort of telling the migration scholars they should learn to write, but there is, like you said, I think there is a way in which we can have a dialogue that's two ways.
So this is me using my knowledge. One of the things that I've been thinking, really from more early career researchers, that some of the work on migration that's emerging now is much more detailed and attentive to state practices than I think some of the work that is now happening around debates about racism, because of the ways in which status is becoming this movable state practices. Sorry, I don't know if people could hear me. And I did wonder if there's a kind of renewal of what an institutional analysis might be that could happen through that kind of critical migration studies.
I think so. I think that is one element of the interrelationship between working on racism and working on migration, which is also evident in work in the United States, in much of the work that has been done recently on migration in the United States. I don't think it's isolated from wider discussions about both the way in which borders become constructed around racialized boundaries, the way in which global patterns of migration are shaped by racism, by racialized practices, and the work of David Fitzgerald, the work of many other scholars has highlighted these issues. And I think there is a potential dialogue. And I think that's kind of what I think we could learn from in the kind of period. Rather than in a way seeing the two fields develop separately, we should try and have dialogue. Even if there's always some element of separation.
Talking is different from what. Okay, yes, this is the end part. Right. So this is like, what would you like to happen in the next phase? Challenges and opportunities. State of the nation.
I have a few points really, but I think I could have like many points. But I just mentioned a few just to get us going. I think one of the issues which I think perhaps we should be thinking about in this field is that I think, like a lot of universities, I say a lot, maybe I'm blinded by what is happening at work, but one of the things at work which has happened in the last few years is that a lot of departments like sociology, politics, philosophy have come across this issue of developing a liberal education with a small L. We don't have to put a big L for liberal education. So we have liberal arts kind of degrees, we have also also ideas about broad education in sort of thinking and understanding society. And it seems to me the field of race and ethnic studies could also do with a bit of liberal education in the sense of actually broadening our fields of vision away from just what we've been looking at over the last 40 years or so that we see it as part of a dialogue with other disciplines across the humanities, the arts, and the sciences as well. So in a way, not envision it as too isolated an area of research. So I would hope, and I'm not sure it will happen, but I would hope that we could see as part of this attempt to broaden our field of vision, so that we don't just have a kind of race and ethnic studies sector which is isolated from the social sciences, the humanities, the arts, and the sciences, that we sort of have a dialogue across, which I think is beginning to happen in universities. So that's one thing which I think would help us. So that, and I think the advantage of that is that we wouldn't be in a position where we're always saying, you know, like isolating the field. We need to become more part of discussions in other disciplines and other areas. So that's one important. I think the second thing, which is actually quite important in my mind, is that as many new scholars come onto the field, so that, for example, I know through the BSA that many PhDs, many early scholars are doing research on this area. The big challenge will be where to see these scholars develop their careers in the future. So it seems to be one of the issues for universities, including sociology departments like my own, is that we need to actually position ourselves in a way in which there is space for this research, and this place will have to be part of people getting jobs and people getting a career. So I think the big challenge in the future will be how to actually envision, not just in sociology, because I think there's too limited a perspective, in other perspectives, issues about developing not just careers for particular generations, there's your generation, there's older generation, there's also kind of other issues. So I think that to me is a big kind of concern and an issue, because I think there are pressures at the moment in universities about particularly the REF, which will impact on how departments develop. And so I think for those of us that occupy influence, or not power, but have influence in our departments, I think that would be a big challenge. A third broad area, I think, apart from this issue of the liberal education side of race and ethnicity, is that I think it will be important that we envision ourselves as not just a national discipline, so that we're in more dialogue with other sociologists or other social scientists. I'm not assuming all of you are sociologists, by the way, but I would say, because I work in a sociology department, I might use that phrase too loosely. But so we envision it as a discipline which is truly international. And I think that means actually talking to our scholars and not assuming that we know what they do and not stereotyping them, and actually trying to have dialogue by going to their conferences, by them coming to our conferences. And I know that it's a resource issue and not everybody can go to every conference. And I think that kind of issue about the international nature of studying this field and researching this field is actually quite important to me. And I think one of the reasons I see the journal as important in my life and my work in the country is that I think it's a space for increasing that dialogue internationally. I think too often we have to go nationally and not seeing what happens in other parts of the world. And I might mention America, I might mention Europe, and actually do mean also in other countries as well, so that we can have that dialogue and develop that dialogue. I think another big issue to me is that if we see this field as a field of teaching, and as I said, as a head of department, sometimes I get cynical about how much people are really interested in teaching, because if you are, how many of you have been in that position as head of department, that many of my discussions with people are about teaching, because people don't want to teach really these days. It's an ironic thing, universities developed in some historical time, institutions of divinity, getting closer to God, and then gradually we became institutions that got closer. And then now we seem to be getting into institutions that somehow think they want to do research, as well as research is separate from teaching. But if we think of teaching as a key aspect of what we do, then I do think we need those kind of discussions that you asked about earlier about what is it we teach in the curriculum. So I don't think we should be thinking about the curriculum of race and ethnic studies as a narrow curriculum. But I think we should try and think, what is it that we want to teach? And as I said, not everybody wants to teach. I know that I said it to Pamela, but I think assuming everybody wants to teach, then I think we should be discussing what is it that we teach as a curriculum, including not just the issue, I think, of decolonizing the curriculum, but actually thinking about what is it that we want to teach that's actually about this area, and engaging the students in that dialogue, because, you know, like many of the students who are like 17, 18, 19, 20, they have things that interest them that we need to engage with when they're undergraduates, and not just want to teach PhD students, which are very different people.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you and then take a few questions. I'm sorry, we only have a few minutes for questions, so I wonder if we could just do 2 or 3 questions altogether and then let John respond if there's people who would like to ask things. I can see 2 at the front. Is that the only 2? The first.
Thank you very much. I've got 2, 3 points to make. One is that, in my opinion, there will never be an end to immigration. My second point is that the hottest news of this week is that a professor of linguistics from Cambridge University proposed that Urdu and Polish languages should be part and parcel of school curriculum. And I was shocked to read the comments on the website of Daily Mail and Daily Express, over 5,000. 99% said that they don't want to learn Urdu or Polish. And she said that integration is a two-way street, not one-way street. Instead of learning Polish and Urdu, we want all those speakers of Urdu and Polish should be deported.
Okay, thanks. Gavin.
John, thanks for your talk. You mentioned decolonisation a number of times, so that suggests it's quite an important issue with the struggle with that.
I come from Warwick, so I'm worried we discuss it almost every day.
Sorry, I know I have a cough, but can you speak up a little
yeah,
bit?
well,
So
like,
people
the
behind
question
you
really is that,
yeah.
in some senses, colonisation is part of human history. That, you know, kind of cultures are always kind of in a kind of dialectic, there's a kind of hegemonic kind of struggle taking place.
Mm-hmm.
So, if decolonising is stripping back, then we kind of go, where do we kind of end? That's the first question. And if there is no end, then is decolonisation really a teleological project? It's looking forward.
Mm-hmm.
And what might that be rather than looking backwards?
Sorry, it's Victoria.
Thank you. One of my questions would be in relation, I think that lecturers now, in relation to teaching, face a barrage of things that maybe happen historically, including, for example, issues around careers, employability, and being able to counsel students and everything else. But those issues aside, which is probably workload management issues, much more insidiously is the issue of law and the implementations of racist and xenophobic laws into university life and the expectation of us being border control agents, for example. Thinking more in an activist capacity as academics, how would you see people being able to actively engage in resistance to things, not just like the prevent duty, but the much more insidious things like being asked to keep monitoring people's attendance when actually effectively you're asking to monitor non-English people's attendance. All these kinds of things that are kind of washed up and our times are taken with other things. How do you see resistance in that kind of capacity?
I think we're just going to take those 3, if that's all right. This time is where it is.
So, I mean, I think your general point is one that I think relates to some of what I said, in the sense that I don't think that, you know, I tend to agree with you that, you know, the wishful thinking that governments is that they can actually somehow put up a border and then...
Sorry, can you speak?
Okay. You know, governments might think that they can put up a border immigrants will stop, and therefore issues will be handled in that way, and that in a way the process of how we live together, how we relate to each other, how communities interact with each other will be handled at that kind of level. Because it seems to me, in a city like we live in here in London or in other cities, the issue of how issues of language, culture, and all those issues are recreated in the coming period will be shaped both by the communities that live here right now and also by new communities that are likely to come in the coming period. Whatever governments think, it's quite clear that immigration will continue as a process over the coming period. So I think the issue then of language and all those issues will be part of what we discuss in our societies. I mean, I think just, yeah, and I would think that that kind of process will be important. I think in terms of the kind of issue, I mentioned the issue of decolonization a number of times, because it's also a live issue in terms of discussions about the sociology curriculum, other curriculums. But I tend to, my feeling as well is that we shouldn't always sort of take it as a simple issue about how you decolonize a curriculum, because it should be discussed at the level of the fact that we do teach in universities where we also value some kind of notion of the autonomy of teachers, some kind of notion of academic freedom, and often the issue of scrutinizing somebody's reading list and almost changing somebody's reading list is a very contentious issue, because many people want to teach in a particular way, they want to use particular authors, they want to use particular kind of examples, whatever. And I don't think therefore it's a simple issue about how we talk about colonization. And often in my own department, in other departments, there's a very lively discussion. And I think it's that lively discussion that should continue rather than assuming that somehow we would just erase certain things from the curriculum and then things will be better. I don't think things will be better if we just erase some things from the curriculum necessarily. They will change the curriculum. I think those kind of issues, I think, are part of the dialogue. So I think your point about where this is going to end is a fair enough point. I think, if we take our situation here and how we teach British history, how we teach British cultural, social history, there are many aspects of that where we can have a dialogue about it, how we teach British society and sociology. Of course, standard courses on the nature of British society need to be taught about in different ways. But I don't think it's a simple answer. And that's part of the thing that's kind of expressed and that's not so clear. And I think the kind of wider issue raised at the back in a way about, it's a very real issue, and as the head of the department, I do think it's disingenuous when monitoring points are talked about as though they're not about immigration, because monitoring points are about particular categories of people, and particular categories of people that are being monitored. My feeling about that is that as a university, we have certain legal obligations in terms of the prevent legislation, and that means that we should be engaging in a dialogue with political institutions, with government, because this government is not going to go away anytime soon in this kind of environment that we're living in at the present time, and that we should be engaging in activities which welcome all the students on our campus to the campus that we work in. That we cannot ignore certain political realities, like governments have power to impose certain legislation on universities or schools and those institutions. So I don't think we can be in a position where monitoring points are just ignored, because that would be breaking the law. That would be putting universities in vulnerable positions. Therefore, the dialogue has to be partly within universities, but also changing the political agenda, so we don't have this legislation. So we don't have this imposition on universities of this kind of legislation. Now, because of the political realities around us, that's not anywhere near on the horizon, and because the next election is likely already decided, in effect. And so we're talking about the mid-20s by the time we have any repeal of the prevent legislation. And again, we shouldn't assume that prevent legislation is just a conservative bit of legislation. So, in a way, to me, there is a political reality around which we have to work, and that's the reality. And here I'm talking a bit as a head of department, because I'm sort of engaged in these discussions with the university. But I'm quite aware that this is the reality in which we live. But we cannot ignore the law, can we? I mean, that's a question mark in a way. I don't think we can.
Not altogether optimistic though. I would thank John for his time.